and pass this off to Tyler and Karen.
Thank you, Amanda. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have you here in this session. So this is a session on ungrading and online learning. It's a discussion of recent scholarship, and we're going to be looking at a particular article. The good news is if you didn't do your homework, which we realized the abstract only was posted as a description in our session description. So Karen will be continuing to add that. You'll see that later, that you can access the article itself. And we've set aside time for you to do your homework here in the session as well. So we'll look a little bit at our agenda, but we'll have some time to do some of the reading, look at the article, and then respond with some questions, and then have a discussion together. So my name is Dr. Tyler Watts. I am an assistant professor at Southern Wesleyan University, and I'll let Dr. Franklin introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Bunch Franklin. I work with Clemson University and the Office of Teaching Effectiveness and Innovation, and I also teach at the University of West Georgia. So welcome. Thanks for joining us.
So Karen and I are colleagues. We do a lot of work together just thinking about innovative practices in online environments. And so lately we've been having discussions about ungrading, and this article came up and we wanted to share it with you and have a chance to respond to it together. Just to very briefly get an idea of who's in the room with us so we can make sure that we're being mindful of who we're speaking to. We had just a couple questions. So we're gonna have you respond in Slido. So if you haven't used Slido before, you can go to this website, slido.com, and enter the code there. And then the first question, just what is your role at your institution? So we've got a couple options there, as well as an other, if you want to let us know about your role.
And I've added those codes in the chat as well.
If you did put other and you want to tell us in the chat what that other is, feel free. Give a couple more seconds just for folks to respond there. Do leave that open. I've got just a couple more questions very briefly that will appear as we go to the next slide.
Looks like we have a nice mix of faculty, educational development, instructional design, and our other OER coordinator. Awesome. We love OER. So fantastic.
Okay, great. Thank you for responding. The next question, just to get another read of the room, is what is your familiarity with ungrading at this point? So if you're faculty, have you used ungrading in your courses? Have you helped develop courses that use an ungrading framework? If you're working in instructional design? Give a couple more seconds for responses there. All right, so somewhat familiar is the majority here, but we have some that are familiar, or a small percentage that are very familiar. So that's going to be excellent for guiding our conversation, because Dr. Franklin and I would be the first to admit we're not experts in this by any means. So we're excited to have some that are familiar with it. And then for those who are unfamiliar, I hope it's a good first taste. Deidre in the chat mentioned reading Bloom's book last summer and trying ungrading, so that's great. Susan Bloom's book is a great one to check out if you haven't already. And last question, just an initial feeling. This is open response. You can put in as many words as you want. when you hear about ungrading, what's an initial feeling that you have, whether you've experienced or tried it, or it's new to you or very familiar? What are your feelings about it? So just as those are coming in, I'll try to highlight some of the ones we're seeing. So difficult to implement in online courses. That's something that can guide our conversation. Interested and hopeful. I liked curious angst was a good one. Hard sell to faculty. It's opportunity, equitable, apprehensive. Boomerang assignments. If somebody mentioned that, I'd be interested in the chat and hearing more about that, or when we get to the discussion, sharing about that. How can we scale? Great question. Excitement. Great. Well, we'll let this kind of guide us. I hope, I think we come at this both from this idea of how do we implement this in instructional design, but also and in online environments, but also what can it achieve for our students, and at the same time without overwhelming faculty. So I think there's some really great questions that we can discuss when we get to that section. Perfect, thank you. So I'll talk about our session outcomes, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Franklin. So really our goal is to describe the impact of ungrading and a pedagogy of care. So this article centers ungrading within this context of a pedagogy of care in online learning context. Discuss what are those institutional and those technical challenges to ungrading approaches that several of you mentioned in the kind of word cloud there, and then brainstorm ideas on how ungrading might be approached in your context. So in the context of your institution or your course, what are some ways that you might consider applying it or approaching it?
Awesome. So what we're going to do, I just put the article link in the chat for you all. So we're going to give you about 15 minutes. It is a fairly short article. Just to kind of read through that, and then we'll have a Padlet where we'll give you some time to answer some questions, upvote, those kinds of things, and then we'll come into a full-fledged Zoom discussion. And so if you'll take a few minutes to grab that article, I'll also add the Padlet in just a second, and then Tyler and I will be quiet so that you can read in peace and quiet.
And while you're opening that article, so these are the questions you'll see in the Padlet. A couple of suggestions when you go to the Padlet, and this can kind of help guide your reading as well as looking at those questions. When you're ready to give some responses to those questions, so you can click the plus that you see under each question, and that will populate beneath it. Consider adding your name to the subject line. So otherwise it will just be anonymous, and that's fine if you want to do that. But if you want us to specifically address it, or you want to speak to that in our discussion, you can add your name in the subject line. We also turn on voting. So if there's something that resonates with you in the Padlet, you can reply to those, and you can also vote to elevate some questions or some insights from our colleagues who are contributing there.
Okay, everyone, we're going to bring you back to the conversation now. We have some really great conversations coming across the Padlet. So just kind of looking at some things that intrigued everyone from the article, some things that we saw. Let's see, I won't read mine because I've already put it in there, but pointing out things that you may not have control over. So, for example, scholarships require grades or GPAs, which are calculated off of grades. Some faculty, maybe adjunct or contingent faculty, may not have an option to do ungrading. So things like that that you want to consider that the article didn't really touch on, so we can have some conversations about that. Someone else wrote just being able to potentially try it on one project or something that was really difficult so that students wouldn't have to focus on a grade. They could focus on the assignment itself and its complexities, or something maybe that wasn't quite as popular. So maybe a way to motivate students to be more active with a particular assignment. Let's see, looking at the idea of pedagogy of care. So asking teachers to put more emphasis on learning versus a letter grade. Let's see. The move away from a consideration of moving away from actually producing a product and just looking at the evaluation of learning, the process of learning. And I do think that is in some of the literature, but I think you'll also find that generally speaking, ungrading doesn't necessarily take away assignments. It just takes away the grade of the assignment. So more of a cycle of practice, revise, or practice, receive feedback, revise, those kinds of things. But there is some literature about that. And then students identifying their own academic goals for the course. So those are some things that really intrigued you all. And you're welcome to keep adding to the Padlet or unmute at this point if you want to jump in and speak to any of these that we're pulling out. And you can certainly write in the chat as well. So there were some great questions that the article generated that we'll want to look at. So, you know, kind of in the history of grading, how administration kind of created that so that they could, you know, show that students were learning things and they could see what students had achieved. And so if that was the case, you know, is it really an objective measurement of students' performance? And is it more time intensive in an online class? So this received a lot of feedback. We'll kind of take a look at this as well in our discussion. So I do think that upfront ungrading probably does require a little bit more time. I don't know that it's going to be a lot different from a face-to-face to an online environment, but we can certainly have that discussion to kind of see. And I think the article does say, again, you don't just jump into it. I think it would be really hard to jump into it. It's interesting because I shifted my class this semester and stopped giving grades mid-semester under the premise of I'm going to, you know, I want to give you feedback. And if I have questions or need clarity, then instead of giving you a grade, I'm going to give you the option to answer those questions or, you know, provide some revisions. And I wasn't sure how my students felt about it because it is an asynchronous online course. However, in our weekly discussions, they were like, we really love this process that Dr. Franklin does. She, you know, gives us an opportunity to receive her feedback and answer questions or make revisions without just slapping a grade on something and moving on to the next assignment. So that made me feel really good this week to see that my students were resonating with that. And so that's just an example there that I'll share. Self-assessment, has there been any pushback in that? Is it being too subjective? Maybe students, you know, giving themselves really high marks when they may not need them. I will say that so far the research shows that that's not the case. When you read the number of folks that are implementing ungrading, they don't tend to say that they see this grade inflation. So I guess that's a positive from what's out there in the literature so far. Is contract grading a form of ungrading? I would say yes, but we can certainly have that conversation as well. Let's see. Thinking about, Oh, go ahead.
I was going to just add to your kind of this question about what the article mentioned about it's not something you should just jump straight into. It takes time to plan and organize. One of the things that I found is I really focus on formative assessments and kind of just this iterative process. And so I've designed my courses, they're fully online as well, that each week they're doing something that's building towards a major project. And so the feedback I got from my students when we switched to something that was ungraded was it wasn't that big of a switch. And I didn't feel like that either because of that emphasis on formative assessment already. And so that might be something if you're saying, I'm not ready to jump into something completely ungraded, but moving towards something that is, whether that's a kind of signature project at the end or several projects that are building on each other, that's getting at kind of the same elements that I think fit into the pedagogy of care that that drive ungrading as well. I think we had mentioned in the chat a great thing, which I think is a great point of bringing up for both students and educators. So Jonathan mentioned my experience with self-assessment is the white men are statistically more likely to give themselves scores higher than I would have. Well, BIPOC and women do the opposite. Neither effect is large though. And there's a lot of good conversation, not necessarily in this article, about the same level of risk at applying ungrading that depending on who you are as an educator, certainly course evaluations were mentioned as a factor to consider, and what would be the impact of your professional career in employing ungrading and how that would be received as well, depending on your background. So I think that's a great point.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I think that's definitely something we need to be aware of if we're going to implement ungrading. And one of the things that, one of the, I guess, pieces of ungrading is that you're really kind of connecting with your students throughout the semester in a very scaffolded way. And so I think you can catch situations like that early on. If you see students like maybe not feeling like they did such a great job, you can kind of work on that and kind of build their confidence up towards the end. They're rating themselves in a way that you yourself would have rated them to begin with. And I think the literature often shows that the majority of the time, the only time grades are changed at the end of the semester is because they're giving someone a higher grade. So a student rated themselves lower than what the faculty member would have rated them as well. So something to think about there. That tends to be the trend that I see in the literature. Let's see. I forgot where we were. Oh, a lot of apprehension for students. I think that's something that's really important because I think we have to recognize that students are coming from K-12, which is very much number driven, very much standardized test driven, grade driven. Someone else mentioned the GPAs and scholarship opportunities. All of that's driven by those grades. And so I think we have to be very conscientious of that and recognize that if we're going to approach ungrading, that we really take a significant amount of time letting our students understand the purpose behind it and what that means for them and what the expectations are for them, as well as what they can expect from you and how you're going to communicate their progress with them throughout the course.
One thing Deidre mentioned in the chat, kind of in response to some of the things you were sharing, Karen, was it feels a lot like portfolio grading. And I think you see a lot of overlap between both portfolios and if any of you have worked in any like competency-based education or really outcome objective-based, there's a lot, I think, of overlap with those types of assessments because it really is an alternative assessment to what we typically are doing or what we think about assessment could be. So great points.
And imposter syndrome is real, right? I think sometimes I even have imposter syndrome when someone calls me Dr. Franklin. I'm like, what? That's so weird to me still. And so I think, recognizing that and helping our students get comfortable in the learning process, right? Our students are so trained to to learn for the grade, that they don't understand that learning process. So I think part of that is just really trying to help them understand that learning process and feeling comfortable with that learning process. And I think when we can do that, that's when students, that anxiety about being in an ungraded situation tends to kind of, lower and not be quite as high. Go ahead.
I guess I wanted to highlight a question that was in the barriers and that might be beneficial to this group with our mix of instructional designers and faculty and because we had several that mentioned that they were very familiar with ungrading. If you have adopted it, do you use the LMS? Do you work outside of the LMS? What has been the approach to that? And I know Dr. Franklin mentioned a couple of things. Mark there was talking about, the LMS sometimes puts you in a boilerplate of what teaching looks like. So I'd be interested if anyone had any comments on that particular contribution. So Deidre mentioned using the LMS, but most of the feedback was with the voice tool.
Oh, don't you love that, Deidre? I try to do that at least once a semester. Sometimes I kind of forget about it. And then I'm like, oh, why didn't I use that? I feel like, especially in an online environment, the voice tool is so welcoming for students. Like, they're just so excited to hear a professor's voice and not just have all this written text. And several faculty at Clemson use it, and they say their students absolutely love it. Like, it's the best thing they ever did. And I think it's less time consuming as well. Like, I take just quick notes as I'm reading through the assignment, and then I formulate those notes into actual dialogue. I think it helps students see us more as like regular folks as well, right? Because when we're doing that, we're saying things like, or my dog barks in the background, or maybe a kid comes running through screaming. And so they connect with you on that level. They see you as a human person.
Mary also mentioned giving students the opportunity to do videos as a formative assessment opportunity. So it can go both ways there, of not only you getting to share who you are and your personality, and give that opportunity to students as well.
I give my students, they can turn any assignment in any format they want. There's only 2 assignments I have, which are infographics they create. So that's the format they have to use. But outside of that, they can use any format they want. And I have a reflection journal they do with the readings each week. And I have someone that does a video, an audio recording every time to talk about her reflections through the readings, which I just absolutely love. It's a nice break from just reading a bunch of text for us as well. Any other questions or any other thoughts on the LMS and ungrading?
Amanda mentioned still see the value of using a rubric to guide students on their achievement of the competency without assigning a grade, and the peer review tool utilizing rubrics without graded assignment as well. That's how I've approached it, is they still can see a rubric of what my expectations are, and then I highlight that in the feedback, and it's just not connected to the gradebook portion of it. So that's a great point.
I don't have a rubric. I don't use rubrics, but I do have a project guide. So all of my courses have a project that's scaffolded throughout the semester. And so I have a project guide, which outlines the different key components that are, due for each piece of the project. So it's like a rubric, but not really like a rubric. It's the closest thing I have to a rubric.
One thing I think, the intrigue questions at the beginning, one thing that might clarify or help those who are new to ungrading is just clarifying in that the most of the examples or models I see are it happening at the course level, and then that being something that's negotiated with the students, whether that's them giving themselves a grade or a reflection where they kind of, you as the instructor kind of mutually agree with the student that this is your grade, that still you're going to have something that's on a transcript. There are some, I think there's going to be a good book coming out this fall that's going to look at it at more of a systematic level. But primarily right now, the models are still working within the framework of grades at an institution. So hitting a lot of those things that were raised as areas of concern of how does this work when you still have scholarships and still have, you know, grad schools looking at grades or wherever that might be. So still having transcripts, but working within the course level.
Yeah, and there are some universities out there that are gradeless, and it's just fascinating to me that an entire university is gradeless, and it's like my dream. So maybe one day I can work at one of those universities. I don't know, but yeah, I think it does. I think the ungrading is more of throughout the semester, and then of course the final grade is turned in because it is a requirement of the university. And I am an adjunct instructor, so I'm not a full-time instructor. And I don't ask permission. I don't know if that's wrong. That might be bad advice, but I don't really ask permission. I just kind of do things that work within my teaching philosophy. And so far, I've gotten a lot of support from the university that I work for. They are very supportive of the work that I do and the changes that I make in the classroom. So I'm very fortunate in that regard. And let's see, Jonathan shared that his whole grad school program was essentially gradeless. Oh my gosh, that is amazing. Oh my gosh, this is fun. I love that. I would say that most of my professors in my PhD program, I mean, they did give grades and they didn't really give opportunities to revise, but I think if they felt like something was really weak, they would come back to you and say, you know, work on this and that kind of thing.
Amanda had the question. I actually want to highlight a couple things. So there was some great discussion of just the tech tools available to be just robust in your feedback, but also in allowing students to use those tools. But Amanda had the question, could you talk more about what your collaborative experience looks like when discussing a final grade with students? So I can speak to my process. It's still a work in progress, but I have a regular reflection that they do. It's actually a discussion in the course, but it's set up. So we have Canvas. It's set up as a group discussion, but with groups of one. So throughout the semester, it's me and the student talking and having a reflection together. So I ask them both about their experience. What are they taking away from different assessments and different projects? And then it's a chance for me to get feedback on ungrading or just how the course is going as well. So at the end of the course, they have to reflect on how they think they performed in the course, what grade they would give themselves, and that's kind of determined from there. And I've never really had to contest that at all. I think they're very honest with their approaches and how they're applying their learning. So that's been, you know, a positive experience thus far. This is my second semester, second term running ungrading. So I'm really new, so we'll see how that goes, but that's kind of how my process works.
Yeah, and mine is similar. So I'm not fully ungraded, but I have always done engagement as a gradeless activity throughout the semester, and students would write a reflection at the end of the semester where they share you know, what they learned by participating in the weekly discussions, and then they share what they feel like they earned. I have only changed those grades for the worse twice, and that was for one student who basically ghosted the class at the end and told her group members that she had dropped the course even though she did not officially drop it. So I was forced to not give her the grade she didn't even do the assignment at all. So I was forced to give her an F. And then I had another student who did not participate at all in the discussions. And I sent him multiple requests to have a conversation to talk about his grade. And he did not respond to any of those. So I had to give him an F as well. I did not give a 0. I think I gave like a 50 or something like that. But he wrote me a letter. He sent me an email at the beginning of this semester and said that he saw my feedback and saw my questions and saw that I'd been trying to contact him. And he felt like what I did was very fair and actually more than fair. So I was actually pretty impressed that he came back to me and said that he appreciated, how I handled it. But we are running out of time. We have about 4 minutes left. We certainly would welcome to continue this discussion in our Discord channel. So we invite you there to continue the discussion. We did not get to all the questions in the Padlet, but if there are any last minute questions, feel free to unmute real quickly or drop in the chat and we'll try to answer those as quickly as we can.
I'm also, while you're thinking or if you're typing, putting our emails there. So I'm sure Dr. Franklin or myself, we'd be happy to discuss more or share about our approaches. I'm always happy to kind of share like how I've designed the course, which is always a work in progress. So if you're looking for examples of what this looks like in an online environment, I'm happy to do that as well. So feel free to reach out either via email or on the Discord channel that Dr. Franklin mentioned.
Yeah, I would absolutely love to continue this conversation. It's something that I'm pretty passionate about and wanting to start the conversations at Clemson. So I would love to continue the conversations at other universities as well. And Jonathan, I think I would enjoy math if I'd gone to a program like you're describing there, where I could just focus on learning math versus constantly worrying about failing a test and an exam. That would be my ideal way to study math. Any other last minute thoughts that someone would like to share with us? Again, we invite you over to Discord to continue the conversation or to reach out to us individually. We did not get to the folks who had a negative experience because they said their faculty or their teacher didn't do a lot. So it made it more of a negative experience. I will tell you that I leave my students like pages of feedback. Like I purposely spend on my group projects about an hour per group, just going through and giving them detailed feedback on everything they've done, good, bad, week. So I am not that person. So you would have liked me if I would have been your professor for ungrading.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. Really great discussion in the chat. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon or evening. And we'll see you, I'm sure, in some of the other sessions continuing in the conference. Thanks.